but it's love to have a lot of friends. And here also Dr. Alauddin from Unihas, Sumatra. He is the head of Master in Law in Unihas. So we have some of friends here from various university, also from this is also Professor Edi Listiono, Prof. Brian. He's a dean of UNTAD Semarang. Is very close with our university when we visit Semarang. Baik, Prof. Edi sehat, Prof. Edi. And I invite Santi. She got her PhD at Leiden University, and she wrote about lawyers in Indonesia, lawyer and power relations, something like that. And she quote a lot of your books. That's why she exciting to be a moderator today.
Nice.
Yeah. Mbak Santi, are you here? Or because 5 EM in Netherlands now.
Okay.
What time is now in your place?
It's 8 p.m. for me.
8 p.m. Okay. Wait. Oh, Santi is here. Hello, Mbak Santi.
Hello.
Legal Consulting. You may rename your account, Mbak Santi.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh. It's suffering for you, right? 5 EM there. Thank you for coming. Prof. Brian, shall we start now?
It's okay with me.
Okay, thank you so much. Dear friends and Professor Brian Gartz, is very honored to invite Prof. Brian here to give lectures to us. Prof. Brian is Distinguished Professor of Law Emeritus and now is Dean of University of California. He's also co-director of Center for Empirical Research and Legal Profession at University of California. Before, he was a Dean of Southwestern Law School from 2005 to 2012. And he was also Dean in Indiana University, Wilmington School of Law in 1986 to 1990. 1986, I was born, 100 years. And Professor Brian already a dean in the prestigious law school. And he was a director of American Bar Foundations from 1990 to 2004. And I have a read from some magazines, but I was just trying to looking for that those magazine, but I didn't find it that mentioned Professor Brian as a one of influential professor in the US. So we are lucky we invite him, and I have invited him in 2012 to give lectures at the Semarang State University. Sorry, you can mute it, admin. And we hope we can invite Professor Brian to Indonesia again after pandemic to give lectures to us and also supporting us to build the Bourdieu circle in Indonesia. He wrote a lot of books dealing virtue, internationalization of palace war, and ASEAN legal revival. One of his writing and very important to Indonesia, both low class and imperialism, mention some of Indonesian sections. I read these chapters and very interesting, mentioning about the role of Ford Foundation sponsor the international legal centers in 1970s in Indonesia. And then the role of Mukhtar Kusuma Atmaja as a Minister of Justice at the times, and also established the law firms. And he mentioned also the modern law firm in the first modern law firm in 1967, when Ali Budiarjo set up the law firm and invite Marjono Reksoti-Putro. He was quoted a lot in the Santi dissertations. That's why Santi here to be moderators, and we gonna see how in the interaction between Santi and Professor Brian. And we gonna make a Bourdieu study in Indonesia in the field of law in the near future. We have more than 20 law school here joining with us. So we will gather, organize these law schools to be part of us. And now I studying the legal company, legal tax company. I run startup, digital startup, and I collaborate with the law schools. And the brand is HeyLaw. So HeyLaw will make Bourdieu circle in Indonesia in the field of law, and collaborate with law school to work with Bourdieu and law. And we have here Santi Kowagam. She's a guest lecturer at Van Vollenhoven Institute at Leiden University. She obtained PhD at VVI, and her doctoral thesis entitled "How Lawyer Win Land Conflicts for Corporations." So it's very related to Professor Brian's writings, and we're gonna hear the amazing discussions moderated by Santi. Okay, Santi, thank you so much. Thank you also for Professor Brian. The time is Santi. Please, you can lead this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Maybe it's night there for you.
It is night. Yes, thank you.
I'm very excited. Really nice meeting you, even though only online. And yeah, I will just hand it to you, Professor Garth.
Okay. First of all, I'm honored to be invited back to Indonesia, even if on a Zoom call, and I'm very honored that you have such a good collection of people. It's I expect that I will give you a kind of a lecture, but I think I will learn by your reactions, and some of the things that I say will probably be a little bit controversial as well, but I will go through, and I am not a PowerPoint person, but I have a PowerPoint just to guide you, to show you what I'm going to cover, and that'll make it easier, especially for those who, who English is a second language, to see the topics that I'm going to cover. So I will share my screen right now. Let's see, too many things on my screen. Here we are. Okay, here's my screen, and I want to get up here and start my little slideshow. Okay, there are only 4 slides, so don't worry. And this is just the title that was given to me by Awaludin, and I think it's a nice title. It's not a title that I've ever used before. So here's what I plan to cover. I want to start with sort of the background of Bourdieu and my own work with Yves Desilets. Then I want to go over things you probably already know, but if you're going to talk about Lawyer Habitus, it makes sense to go through some of the basics of Bourdieu's theory as it applies to law. Then I will focus really particularly on habitus, and then I will kind of conclude by talking about the title of actually the book that Yves Desilets and I have that is coming out in September, which is also about Asia, but it's not about Indonesia in this book. It's about South Korea, India, Hong Kong, China, and Japan. So we've expanded our work bravely to try to include China and Japan, and we'll see how that book goes. But so I think it's kind of interesting. I hope it's interesting to you if I tell you a little bit about how I started getting interested in Bourdieu. I met Yves Desilets at a conference of the Law and Society Association, and we decided that we would try to get a grant together to study international commercial arbitration. And I had heard of Bourdieu at that point, but I had not read anything. But Yves was a Bourdieu student, and he was at that time trying to apply Bourdieu to the transformations in lawyering taking place with the increasingly opening up of the economy in the European community. So what they called the Big Bang in London in particular. So I went to the Law and Society meeting in Amsterdam in 1986, the year you were born. And Bourdieu was there, and I met Bourdieu, and I said to Bourdieu, you know, I expect I will become more familiar with your work, but now I know it mostly through my friend and collaborator, Yves Desilets. And Bourdieu said, which is perfect for him, he said, there are worse mediations. So if you can understand that, it means there are worse ways of introducing Bourdieu than through Yves. So we started working with our first book, and Bourdieu, as kind of background, wrote very, very little about law. And the part that he wrote about law was often about the very formal law associated with Germany and the Professorenrecht. And he did not really write much about, you know, England, the US, you know, different modes of the reproduction of law. But he got interested in it, I think, partly through our work. And he had lectures in 1991 that were published after he died called On the State, Sur l'État. And those I recommend to you because they are really very interesting in developing this work that he really never published. These were just lecture notes that were then published as a book. So that's my kind of introduction to Bourdieu, who stayed involved with our work throughout his life and wrote introductions and translated one of the books, interestingly enough, from English into French. He didn't translate it, but he published it in his series. So this is now basic Bourdieu, and the basic Bourdieu is about legal fields. So the legal field is defined as a space, a social space of competition. And the actors are competing. And why are they competing? Because they all are oriented toward the rules of the game of the field. So they almost intuitively, or else they've been guided, they compete for success in the field, but they play by the same rules. the rules that actually help the field survive and prosper. So the legal field is not a thing, but it's a concept, a tool for research that you use to understand, what law is in a particular place. And the kind of competition that happens depends on what are the forms of capital. This sounds abstract, but it's not at all, I think. The forms of capital valued in the field. So you can understand the forms of capital as, college degrees, law degrees, advanced law degrees, scholarly writing, family advantage, experience with the state. There are all these things that can be valued in the field. And in every place, what is valued is similar, but also a little bit different. So the forms of capital that are valued in the field, you can understand by kind of comparative and international historical study, because legal fields everywhere are, of course, related to the state, to the country, to the particulars of it, but they also developed out of an interconnected history that goes all the way back to the medieval times. So if you say the forms of capital valued, but there is also competition, and I hope you're staying with me on this, people are competing using the forms of capital that are valued in the field. But they also are competing to make what they represent more valued, to make what they have taken more seriously in the field. And that is why we refer to lawyers above all as brokers, because lawyers make connections, they develop new theories, they make connections to countries even by studying abroad. And if they are successful, what they use as brokers brings them status in the legal field, brings them power, and also, and I can talk about this later, they can become brokers of a kind of social change. So lawyers who graduate from school, start to practice, or join an NGO can become brokers by representing, emerging political movements, emerging economic powers, or even emerging changes in global competition. So if we think that China is rising in global power, or if we think that over the last several decades, the US has been rising as a global power, one of the ways lawyers as brokers build their power is by connecting to what seems like and may be the emerging global power. And I will give examples of how this works later on, but let me just pause and ask, does this make sense so far? Are you following what I am saying? Because it's a little bit abstract when you talk about capital and brokers and fields and capital, as I said, but if anyone wants to stop me, put your hand up and ask me for a clarification question. But otherwise, I will just keep on going, okay? So as no one's chatted what's going on or anything like that so far. So the outline, so now I want to go to habitus in particular. So I have to go down or, okay. So in the story that I just told, habitus is a word that describes how people operate in relation to a field. Put simply, if you want to be a lawyer and you want to be a successful lawyer, you will learn, and some people learn it from birth, but you will learn from looking around you, what are the ways that people behave in order to be successful as a lawyer. Bourdieu usually writes about strategies. So what is a strategy to succeed in the field? And strategy does not mean intentional strategy. It doesn't mean it's something that you thought out and planned necessarily. It might mean it just made sense to you to do this in order to be successful. And habitus is a wonderful way to distinguish between different countries, between different legal fields, because if you do, and this is what we do in our research, is we try to interview lots of different people and try to understand through those interviews, how do they make their careers? What do they value? What do they not value? And the collective biography of all those people ends up telling you what the habitus is. Now, the habitus is not something that is fixed, but it's something that may change, but usually there's a kind of continuity in the story. And what I want to suggest is that there's almost is, and this is why I like your title, there is a kind of lawyer habitus that goes beyond particular cultures, places, times, that has continuity even as the world and local contexts change dramatically. So that's a kind of a theme. So the habitus is a key concept because it's a kind of way of describing how lawyers behave. Now, why do you care about how lawyers behave? It's not that you care because you want to get to the top yourself, but you want to study things like lawyer relationships to family power, lawyer relationships to economic power, lawyer relationships to scholarly expertise, lawyer relationships to cosmopolitanism, to connections outside. And all of these relationships, and of course, lawyer relationships to the state. All of these relationships are embedded in a way in the term habitus, because it explains how lawyers operate in relation to the world, which is the legal field, but the legal field also in relation to fields of political and economic power. Okay, so far I think okay. Now I'm going to see how I'm doing it. All right, now here are some examples of different kinds of lawyer habitus. I'm going to pick a few countries. One that is very easy is the United States. In the United States, since the 19th century, if you want to be at the top of the legal profession, connected to the state, connected to economic power, your instinct, your mode of behavior will be to get into the very best college you can get into. And since law is a graduate degree, the very best law school you can get into. And then you will also want to get into one of the top corporate law firms. And the most prestigious members of the legal profession in the United States are high court judges, some top litigators, but above all, elite corporate lawyers in the very top law firms. And so this is a fairly remarkable lawyer habitus. It never existed in any other country until recently. There were no such things as corporate law firms. And the notion that the corporate law firm is a kind of broker between power, the state, the economy, private and public, is really kind of remarkable. But that's one example of lawyer habitus, we could say. But there are different variations. So if we go to India, and let's say you live in Mumbai, and you want to be a leading lawyer, power broker in India, your aspirations will lead you to want to be a top advocate, and then maybe later judge in the high courts and in the Supreme Court of India, to be a barrister, even though they technically don't have the distinction between barristers and solicitors. Those are the most prestigious lawyers in the country. They are the ones most likely to be called on for public service. They are the ones who handle the biggest disputes. And they, of course, are a product of English colonialism. So it used to be that the top ones had all been educated in England, probably like Indonesia, where they were educated in the Netherlands. But now, as independence came, that degree became less essential. And then it was local degrees with, some kind of international travel also still happening fairly often. But if you're an ambitious lawyer in Mumbai, you could go today to one of the 20 or so, with maybe 3 or 4 top ones, national law schools that are very competitive to get into. They require very high grades, very high test scores. So if the habitus of the elite lawyer was the same as it is in the United States, you would expect everyone who's ambitious to want to go to those very competitive schools. But that's not true. If you were in Mumbai, you would go to the government law college in Mumbai, where they only teach classes until 8 o'clock in the morning, where the students rarely attend, and where the whole point of going to school there is to spend the rest of your day apprenticing, working with already high court barristers and getting to know them, and using mainly your family connections to get those kinds of positions. And so the top lawyer in India is not a corporate lawyer. They do have corporate lawyers, but is a barrister produced out of a course of study that really teaches you very, very little. You only learn as an apprentice, and you learn mostly the tools of litigation in the high courts. So the habitus, there are some similarities, and now, and I'll talk about this later, many more Indian law graduates get degrees abroad, including especially in the US, but it's really very different. So there, and I could go on to many examples because I've been doing this for a long time, but I don't want to go on forever. So now, one of the things when we talk about lawyer habitus is we have to talk about law's relationship to power, because legal fields and the lawyers in them, if they are successful, they serve power. That is, they serve power because power would not submit to law unless law basically served them. But the trick is that law serves power, but if this is working correctly, the powerful agree to submit to law, maybe not every time, but they agree to submit in law in exchange for them having legitimacy for protecting their property, their families, their political power. And so the legal field and the lawyers in it have patterns of behavior, and I can easily explain it for the Indian example and the US example, have patterns of behavior where the top of the profession, which is a social construction, the top of the profession serves power. And power gains from that because it gets the legitimacy of the law. So now I want to go back into history a little bit and focus on almost the history of the lawyer habitus. It starts in the Middle Ages, and the elements are still there that we find in the Middle Ages. In Bologna, the first European faculty of law in the time of the 10th and 11th centuries started having professors who taught this corpus juris, which was just recently discovered as part of Roman law. It was highly formal, very deeply reasoned, and it had prestige because it was linked to the Roman civilization and the Roman Empire. So this body of law was discovered in a time of some social transformation, just before the rise of the city-states like Florence, as trade was growing, as commerce was growing. And what the students of the corpus juris and the professors learned was the formal rules and complex legal formal reasoning, which all of you know about because you studied law. That Roman method of reasoning was highly useful to the graduates who mastered this. Why? Because they got respect for mastering this complex material, this complex scholarly material. They were part of a group that studied for years in Bologna. So they were a transnational network of elites who met and then had relationships later on. And the corpus juris, like law generally, was such that it could be used to resolve the disputes. And around, as feudalism was declining, you had all these jurisdictional disputes, including the disputes between the Catholic Church and the emerging governments. And this corpus juris and the reasoning behind it empowered these first group of lawyers to be put in a position where they could make arguments and they could resolve disputes on the basis of this corpus juris. It was autonomous in a sense, but it also could be calibrated so that the powerful liked it. They didn't lose too often. So they thought this was better than violence and better than other ways of resolving disputes. So the origin is, think about it, it's elites. They're the only ones that can go to Bologna and study, who come from prominent, aristocratic families. They master this complex material. They are cosmopolitan because they must speak multiple languages and they must interact, and they did travel around Europe. And that makes the first lawyers, and there's a wonderful book about this that you'll find cited also in Asian legal revivals, about the creation of the legal profession. So the habitus there is scholarly, cosmopolitan, elites. And it diffuses in Europe, but it kind of divides a little bit, so that in England, it's more like what I described in India, where family capital matters more, the barristers become the elite and the ones close to power, and the faculties of law are completely marginalized. So unlike the faculty of Bologna, which is the center of respect, the faculties of law in Britain are depreciated. And until very recently, almost no lawyers in England even bothered to get a law degree. They only studied with the bar. While in Germany and the other countries in Europe, mostly, the professors retained a certain power as law was reconfigured to serve first the Prussian states and then other states modeled on the kind of strong state for a kind of catch up to British, more decentralized capitalism. So you've got this origin, you have this kind of basic habitus, and then it starts to spread through the empires and some competing empires. And what we always say is what happens in the outposts of the empire is a kind of a distorted mirror of what the colonizer had, because it always relates to local power, because the colonizers tried to co-opt local elites and bring them into the law to both serve the empire and to keep order domestically. So you have these changes and you have these different relationships between the colony and the colonizer in the different countries. And what Eve and I wrote about in Asian legal revivals was how law became kind of discredited in the countries that we studied and then revived, especially in the period after the Cold War ended, when the US had global hegemony. And the US mode of regulation of the world was much more legalized than it had been in the past. So all of those things, that change in global hegemonic relationships changes also the habitus and the strategies of those in different countries, because they realize that the prestige of law in the US has gone up, not because it's better, but it's gone up because of US global power, soft power. And therefore, many actors in different countries start to orient themselves as brokers to new power relationships, to import the expertise that's coming out of the US and to make change, including marketization and different other things in accord. And it's more complex than that, but in relation to what's being exported. So that takes you to Asian legal revivals. And our new book, we think, goes much beyond that, because what we argue is that there's a problem. Law serves power, but when law serves power and new politics changes or global hegemony changes, how does power that is in bed with the leaders change to a new set of leaders without being purged or something like that? And so that's, how do you make legal revolutions? And there's a scholar named Harold Berman who writes about law and revolution, who links very well with Bourdieu in this, because what Berman suggests is that those who are already very conservative, aligned with power, maybe a kind of legal oligarchy, they resist change. They resist new scholarship. They resist new ideas. They resist political change. They become very conservative. They become more family-oriented. They become very comfortable, very complacent. And there are many examples of that. And then some upstarts, in coming especially out of scholarly groups, they begin to say, you are too conservative, too old-fashioned in your ideas, too much in bed with the political power. We have new ideas, and we invest in new scholarship, and we are going to show, both reinvent law, but also reinvent it in relation to new emerging political forces that might be domestic, might be global. And they use that political alliance with ideas. See, the politicians like the idea of a new generation of lawyers, giving them the credibility of law. And the new group likes the idea of being close to political change. So they form an alliance and you can watch them make change. But then what happens is, after they make change, the lawyers, and lawyers are called different things in different countries, I should say, the lawyers refurbish, that means reinvent, re-legitimate the existing institutions, the existing habitus, because they want to be at the top of the profession as they saw it when they were looking up and they were dissenters. So they reproduce the same institutions, which links to kind of the old power as well as the new power. And it means that you have a legal revolution, but it's a revolution that didn't change very much because law was a very conservative force. And it's also can be destabilizing, but it's conservative in part. So what the theme of our book now, and we don't cover Indonesia, but is that since the 1990s, there has been a legal revolution exported out of the United States. And in law and development, which Abaludin talked about, where the US tried to export changes in the legal profession, but were not too successful. This time, it's more importing than exporting, because there is a global spread of corporate law firms modeled on the US, more or less. And the corporate law firms have a new kind of expertise that is invested more in in-depth legal argument, interdisciplinary analysis, I want to say, big legal institutions, complex litigation, and so that's being exported as part of corporate law, also hiring from meritocratic, high-achieving law students. And with the rise of corporate law firms, which has taken place over a period of time, suddenly those who are supporting corporate law firms, who are part of the corporate law firms, they see that corporate law firms are becoming desired careers, which are different than the traditional hierarchies. And they want to reform law school to be training people in things like problem solving, have more engaged lecturers, have interdisciplinary study. And this becomes a weapon against the those who are at the traditional top of the legal profession. It becomes a kind of a battle, and that's what our latest book is about, is a battleground, so that it's too much to tell you the whole story, but in India, the graduates of the national law schools, which are merit-based, mostly to relatively privileged kids who can excel on the tests, but it's merit-based, it's not family-based. The graduates mainly go into the law firms. They do not go to the bar because they don't have the family connections. And they work in these law firms and they do international transactions, and they get international degrees, and they begin to like these modes of argument that they think are sophisticated, the cutting edge. And what they find is when they try to tell those arguments to the leading members of the bar who are going to make the argument for them, the members of the bar say, I don't understand, I don't like that, I'm going to do what I've been doing my whole career. And so there's now a movement within India by these graduates, by allies in government, to challenge the power of the bar, to challenge its family domination, the fact that it's all old, white, Brahmin and Parsi males, and to try to force them to change. And so right now, the bar has not changed. And so you can watch in India all the places around that are challenging the bar. But if the theory of Lawyer Habitus is correct, if they succeed, there will be a legal revolution, because law schools will be more important as in relation to families. Legal argument will be more sophisticated. The teaching will be more engaged. There will be more practical teaching. All of those things will happen and will change the legal profession in very important ways. But it will re-legitimate the bar because it will be upgraded by this. It will be made more legitimate, more suited for an age of financial capital, for better or worse. It will be more aligned with the power as it is emerging today and in the last couple of decades. So the revolution will also be a reproduction, because the same institutions, which are also tied to old families and things in India, will be there. So that's one example of kind of this challenge, but also reinvention potentially of the Lawyer Habitus in India. And other examples, and I'll give you just one more, I think, and that's China. China has always been internationalized in the legal profession. It's not something that people have studied much, but even when China opened up to the West, and during the Republic period, and even into Mao's communism, the leading intellectuals were always Western educated, and that was true in law. They were the subjects of the Thousand Flowers Bloom and the anti-rightist campaigns and the Cultural Revolution, and they were nearly destroyed. But when law was restored in the late 1970s, the same cosmopolitan group associated with the European-style schools came back, readjusted, rebuilt a legal profession that has strong international ties, and easily adjusted to two things. One is the changing world economy, and the other is the changing balance of power within the communist state. So unlike the resistance that you see in India, in China, it's exactly the opposite. Completely adjusting to the new revolution, again, transforming the habitus in certain ways to be oriented towards this new kind of global trade and global financial capital, but also, rebuilding the hierarchies, but also keeping them the same. So I could provide other examples of that, but the point of the story is that there is Lawyer Habitus is a way of seeing the continuity and the change that takes place in different countries, that takes place globally, since all the stories are interconnected. What happens in one place is related to what happens in another. Changes in global balance of power, like the rise of China, have impacts everywhere in the world. And lawyers are very good at absorbing them into their own patterns of behavior, changing through this complex, mysterious process of legal revolution where things change, but also stay the same, and then thrive and then become conservative as they then link up with the next, with the power of the day. So lastly, I've got a slide here.
Kabar baik, satu baik.
Okay, I've got one more.
Wah, biar dapat lagi yayasan.
Okay, this is just too, the timing is just too good. Oh, I have to go back. The timing is a little bit too good, I can't resist, but our new book that's coming out in September and will be open access as well as available, but globally open access, will be published in September 2021 by the University of California Press. And you see the title, and we couldn't resist. At the top is the University of Bologna, and it looks very similar. This is the argument about how the habitus changes, but many things do not. Below is Harvard Law School. So you can see that they are the same, even though it's all very different. So I'm happy to take questions, and I guess I can unshare my slide unless somebody wants to see something there. And if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, I got it. Let's go back to this. That's, oh, here we are. Stop share. Okay. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for that very, very interesting lecture. I have some questions, but I will give the floor to the audience first. Is there any question from the audience? I see Professor Sulistyawati Irianto. Are you here, Professor? Maybe she'll come back. I saw Professor Sulistyawati. She's a professor of law and anthropology in Universitas Indonesia, and maybe she wants to comment. But we'll come back to that. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. First, it's really, well, first of all, I agree with everything you say, and I used your work extensively in my dissertation, and it's really, really useful because, yeah, as you said, it's quite difficult to link Bourdieu with law, and but I think it's also very true what he described as capital and habitus. And in my work, I was interested in describing the strategies that lawyers use. So my first question to you is that you mentioned interviews as a method to find lawyers' habitus. How do the two relates with interviews and finding habitus? What could you find there? What could you because in habitus is really broad, as I understand it. You also try to find almost people's beliefs. So how did you do that with interviews?
You do it with interviews. You can also read lawyer biographies sometimes to learn about it. But what you see is after a while, our interviews are always the same. We start out by asking them a little bit about their background. And our method usually is to say, do you come from a family of lawyers? Which is much better to get an answer than if you say, what is your social class or something like that. So then we ask, you know, we really start them, you know, why did you go study law? Why didn't you become an economist? Why didn't you, you know, become a priest? You know, and you don't have to interview everybody that way, but you see the choices they make, what they rejected, why they went this way and not that way, and you begin to make sense of, you know, what the role that lawyers have played. And I'll give you an example from our interviews in Jakarta. We started interviewing these pretty famous corporate lawyers, and more than 4 or 5, we interviewed them in their offices. And typically their background was that they came from elite families who had been, you know, part of the Javanese aristocracy, and they were the descendants who did not want to be part of the Suharto government, but wanted this privileged intermediary of law firms. So they were thriving, making lots of money, you know, brokering investment into Indonesia. But every single one of these people, after we interviewed them, they said, now do you want to see what I really care about? They would walk us into their NGO, you know, that, you know, was their way of kind of rejecting their corporate law life and trying to be involved in anti-corruption or, you know, very different kinds of initiatives. And you can say what you want about whether it was successful but you could see that their heart was in this. And that's a kind of a lawyer habitus that is recognizable to us, even in the United States. The first generation of corporate laws, and it still continues, corporate lawyers were both serving these ruthless capitalists, and then they were also working to regulate the capitalists. And they were working both sides, but the both sides, in a way, served the corporations because it made the rules to restrain the corporations so that they wouldn't be overturned, you know, by a social revolution or something. So, but they still were resisting at the same time as they were serving. And so it was a surprise, because you don't find that most places. And I don't know if it still continues, but I know that many ambitious lawyers that we interviewed also all wanted to work at the Legal Aid Society before they went into their careers, also to kind of have this connection. And I don't know Indonesia nearly as well as I know the countries I've talked about today, but that's just suggestive of the kinds of things that you find. You also find family. When you asked if you come from a family of lawyers and they say, yes, going back 3 centuries, you learn something about the role of family in reproducing the legal profession.
Santi, may I?
Yeah, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very interesting.
I can't quite hear you. I think there's some noise.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And sorry for not showing my face. Yeah. In my limited observation, there are many professors like Richard Susskind who predict that in the near future there will be disruptions because the artificial intelligence will replace all the lawyer jobs, and my question is, what is the implications for a country like Indonesia, and what is the connections, the disruptions of digital lawyering future of lawyer law?
Okay. I heard a little bit what you said, especially the part about Richard Susskind. And so I will address that. And you added a few things, but I'm not sure. But I will tell you, in my other body of research that I haven't been doing with Yves Desilets, but is very Bourdieusian, is I'm part of a group where we've been studying the American legal profession by following them longitudinally for 18 years. So this is a 20-year plus project where we interview them and send them surveys over the course of their careers. So we have their career trajectories, we have their habitus in spades, because we know exactly, what choices they make, how they use their degrees, how it's different for women, how it's different for minorities, all those kinds of things. And we are now writing an introduction to a book on that. And part of what we have to confront is, okay, we've studied these lawyers for 15 years. And for 10 or 8 or 9 of those years, they have been told, and we have been told, that there is an end of lawyers or an end of big law coming. And it turns out that this is not true. It's not going to happen. AI is not going to replace lawyers.
Okay.
And why? Exactly what I was talking about today in my talk is that AI will have dramatic changes on the legal profession.
Mm-hmm.
But lawyers, there will be entrepreneurs in the academy and in the law firms and in other legal practices and in the corporations who will absorb. They will be entrepreneurs on behalf of using the new technologies, bringing them in, but protecting their profits as partners and as lawyers, and still becoming essential in the places where you need a person who has connections, a person who gets phone calls returned, a person who is inventing new ideas. And so the AI, what we call the gurus of the profession always want to say the age of disruption is here. And so we have one of our co-authors, his name is David Wilkins. He's a very well-known Harvard law professor. And he wanted to write, to help us write a first chapter version called, and the future, the age of disruption. And we started looking at our data and how disrupted it's been over time and how brilliant the legal profession is at absorbing change. Because think of this legal profession in the 1960s was white men with wives at home who were educated at only a very few schools. Civil rights revolution comes, women, minorities, people from disadvantaged backgrounds all say, you law firms have to let us in. You can't just discriminate against us. Law firms have done that. They've opened up. But at the same time, those people don't make partners, but they are placed in good jobs. Some of them make partners, but most of them, they don't. So now the corporate law firms are much more legitimate, much more open to people from all schools, all races, all genders. But the partners, at the end of the day, the equity partners are still white male graduates from elite law schools with wives at home. So they absorb it, they re-legitimate, but it's still the same.
I think I agree more with your conclusion than Richard Susskind.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
But that's good news to hear that it's not the end of lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
I also want to comment about this type of lawyers that you research on, because it is they are elite in the globalized world, in the globalized capital. While when I did my research in Indonesia, I found that the most powerful lawyer in Indonesia, it's not actually a pure corporate lawyer. They are what I call fixer. And this kind of lawyers, they combine the power of capital, of family capital, and with their knowledge of law. And it also means that they use the law in a way that is almost or maybe already corrupt. So they don't hesitate to use the law as a means to reach their goal. Now this is a local type of lawyers. They are not globalized. They don't cooperate with international law firm, but I think they are understudied in the study about lawyers. So these lawyers refer to themselves as, they said, I am a family lawyer. Means they represent the richest family in Indonesia in all matters about law, starting from the inheritance to their businesses, which is usually large, about food or housing or land, real estate development business. And then you said that in countries like China, this perhaps this kind of lawyers, they just merge to the powerful. So the question is that if I read, and there are numerous theories about how we can see, we can examine power, and I was drawn to Luke's definition on dominant power. And then that I agree that it really applies to Indonesia, because Luke's say, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is an intrinsic kind of power. There is a power just being someone. And I see this a lot in Indonesia, because we, to an extent, we are still a very well, so-called traditional society. We have to respect the elders, for instance, all of those traditional values that not formal values. So it also means that people are not equal. So the question is that if lawyers and law move to this kind of rational, formal situation, maybe perhaps that is not a better thing, as you said. Maybe it's not an upgrade, because then we lose the kind of humanity behind law.
First of all, I love your observations, and I hope you will invite me to one of your Zoom lectures so I can learn more. Because in our study of Indonesia, we were really confined to sort of who touched the international, the NGOs, and we recognize it was a limitation. And sometimes I think we've gotten better at finding things like that as we've done more work. But I'm curious, do those fixers ever run for political office or anything like that?
Well, they really avoid politics.
Okay.
If you want to be a good lawyer, you don't do politics. But they cannot help being dragged to politics, because anti-corruption movement is strong in Indonesia.
Well, you find those kinds of lawyers in Italy, who are not corporate lawyers. They tend to do criminal defense, but they also are connected to, wider family structures, especially in the South. And corporate lawyers, the one thing really important to say, I am not saying that corporate lawyers are the most prestigious lawyers in every country. They absolutely are not. They have gained in prestige, but it's a US generated theory that serves the US to say that the world is all becoming, committed to a legal profession led by corporate lawyers who behave the same as they do in the US. And it's a modernist theory that really is misleading. Certainly you see elements of it, but it's not inevitable. It can be reversed. And the local story is always more important. Now you go to Brazil, they've got many large law firms, and corporate law firms play a big role. But the key person in Brazil is someone who is a jurist, a professor, maybe also in politics, maybe also in business, maybe does some opinions for companies, maybe also might have a law firm, and that hires largely based on family relationships. And that person is really above the law. And this is a great interview in telling you about Habitus. We interviewed a corporate lawyer who said that when he was practicing law, he was about 45 years old. He was on an airplane to Brasilia, and one of his old classmates looked at him with contempt and said, "Are you still practicing law?" Because the elite career was something above, around, connected to families, connected to law, but not bothering with, the details of mastering the law. And so it was quite striking. And I can't resist another example is at the University of Sao Paulo, which has a lot of these people. We know two professors who are full-time professors. And from the American perspective, you say, wow, you got one of the only full-time professorships at the University of Sao Paulo. Everybody else is part-time. And what they said, and this was a surprise, they said, do you know what the other professors think of us? They think of us as failures because all we're doing is teaching. And so it tells you really that to be at the top there is a very different profile than what we see. And that's why this Indonesian, I hope you write about it in a language that I can read because it's really fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote it in English, and it's also, yeah, I think it's also true in Indonesia because these fixers, they don't go to court anymore and they let their associates go to court. They just go behind the back in between businessmen or politicians to fix things, so to say.
Well, can I add one more thing? We did hear when we were doing interviews about people talking about other law firms, people in one law firm talking about another law firm, because everybody pretends to not be corrupt,
Yeah, that's also what I found.
But they would say that the other law firms are just one step from the fixers. They use them, but they are able to maintain enough of a distance so that they are internationally legitimate, but they know that they have to do business, and to have to do business, they have to connect to what you need to connect to. So they might have been internationalized in some way in that sense.
Yeah, they do outsource work, especially when the executives get into problem with criminal law. Then they give it to the fixer. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I also have a comment about the origins of law that you mentioned. You started from Bologna, sort of is a story about formalization of law. And back to my traditional method of doing law, the article that really struck me when doing my PhD is by a historian, Dutch historian, Huizinga, and he had a chapter about play and law, and he said that law, basically law is a kind of play, and to that reasoning, then law is really, really old, And also the player, even though we don't call them lawyers, they still play by, it's a sort of game. So it's still, it's still bringing us back to the traditional, traditional method of doing
Yes.
law. Yeah.
And even in my country, where we all say we are interdisciplinary and anti-formalism, if you go to, you know, a talk where somebody is applying for a job as a professor, and if the talk is too much interdisciplinary, too much sociological, they will say it has no theory, because they mean legal theory, and legal theory is still tied to this formal reasoning. And so even though legal theory is much different in Germany than it is the United States, that sort of key formalistic part has never gone away. And it's basically what defines, you know, the power of law is using that legal formalism to be of service to power, which also builds your own power. And the beauty of law is it can adapt slowly, but it can adapt by absorbing new arguments, new ideas, and it will still look the same. The categories will still be the same.
Yeah, and what do you think about the relationship between, so you mentioned about lawyers' relationship to power and to capital. What about the lawyers' relationship to law and other actors in the legal system, such as judges and prosecutors? How do their practice affect the legal system?
Well, it's, you know, all the players play, you know, significant roles, and in some places the advocates, which means also the prosecutors and the defenders and the criminal, are like in India or in England, they are more prestige in making the law, the courts and the barristers, than are the professors. So they are the leading, you know, oracles of the law, the people that speak the law. And in the United States, that's long been the case as well. But since the 1930s, professors have grown in power. And part of maybe what I should have said of this legal revolution that has these actors promoting reforms, one of the reforms that's promoted is an upgrading of the status of law professors. Because in many parts of the world, law professors have very little status in relation to practitioners, prosecutors. And, you know, I can add another example from the new book, which is South Korea, where prosecutors are the top of the profession. You know, the habitus of the ambitious lawyer there is to become a public prosecutor. That's the first choice job. And public prosecutors can retire to be corporate lawyers, they can be professors, but they've reformed legal education to try to lower the power of the prosecutors and the judges, because the prosecutors and the judges have enormous power, but they also do not use the power against the government, the authoritarian government, or against the chavals, the very big businesses. So the democratic reformers wanted to reform law school in order to diminish the power of the socialization of this, they call it the Legal Research and I think Legal Research Institute, that's not quite the right title, where they are all socialized into this very conservative role. So they wanted to shut that down and put power in the law schools and have people pass a bar exam that was not administered by the judiciary and the prosecutors. And they succeeded, but the prosecutors are still just as conservative because it's so embedded and it's still the most desired career. And if any of you watch Netflix, almost every one of these Korean Netflix movies is about the power of the prosecutors and the corruption and their relationship to big business and to politics. And it's fascinating. It's actually, you learn more about it than you do from our chapter on Korea, I think.
So are you a fan of Korean TV shows?
I am because I found that the popular media, is more willing to talk about, what the actual role is, which is kind of understood than people that you would interview, of course. And it's not that, it's not that there isn't a big independence of the prosecutors in most cases. They're pretty well trained. They stay to the facts and the law. But when the stakes are high for the conservative government or the very big business, the prosecution tends to be on their side. There were in Japan, which gave Korea their legal system, gave South Korea its legal system. In the last year, you'll remember that one of the big Japanese corporations was being run by, I think he was an American, maybe he was a European, and the prosecutors arrested him for corruption. He had to sneak out of the country, and people said, why? I thought the Japanese prosecutors were neutral and well-trained. And the answer is, yes, they are. But when it comes to defending their corporations, not so much.
Yeah, but is Professor Sulistiawati here? Maybe as Professor Gard said, maybe there is still hope that the Indonesian law professor will gain more prestige in the future.
I'm sorry, I asked Professor Brian.
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Thank you, Professor Brian. I asked, Laura, in the USA, we very respective how to become a lawyer. Is there a special education law? Because in Indonesia, there is special education.
Yeah, and what do you mean by special education?
Yeah. Lawyer in the, sorry.
Oh, you mean legal education is a unique education just to create lawyers? Is that what you mean? Yes.
Yeah.
And that's kind of spread to Japan and Korea. And part of this movement that I associate with corporate lawyers, there was a period of time, especially after the financial crisis, when Japan, Korea, and even China started saying, we need older lawyers who are educated in more than just the law, in social values. They have more life experience, and part of what they're saying is we're trying to compete with global corporate law firms, and we want to create our own home law firms by training people in a similar way. And that is not going to be a global trend to do that, but it probably is a global trend for people to get master's degrees and advanced degrees, and that first degree is no longer enough in most places for you to have a really successful career. So the stakes have gotten higher. And so there's a little bit of a kind of increase in the competitiveness that you see in all the places. And even in the US, people are, if you want to do tax or something, you need a different degree than your first law degree.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. We're almost out of time. Perhaps Awaludin have a question or comments?
Yes, thank you, Mbak Sabdi and Prof. Brian. And the question from Prof. Edi Listiono and Bu Sulis. there are my teacher also and my mentor here. And I would like congratulate to the new books. Perhaps the books can be accessed soon, and we can read and learn more about your new theory and new books. And we will love to invite you after pandemic to Indonesia and to have the conference with some law schools, and perhaps we gonna make joint research in the near future,
That would be
because
great.
your new books without Indonesian chapters, I think we did add more about Southeast Asia, including Indonesia.
Yes, that would be, when I did study Indonesia, it's fascinating place to study. And, the whole history of law from this tiny little profession is fascinating. And I am very interested in what is happening in legal education here. Is there this kind of reform movement at all? I know there's some private schools that are more, we could say, US, European oriented, and more clinics and things, but I don't know much about it. I tried to find stuff online, but I haven't been really successful. So it seems there's not that much change happening, or at least it's not yet in places where I can see it, but I look forward to learning more. So I appreciate that.
Amazing. Maybe, but someday you have to send your PhD thesis to Professor Brian.
Yes, I think so. I would love that. Yes, and if
Sure, yeah, I can send the book to you. My pleasure. It's,
and I used to be the editor of the Journal of Legal Education in the United States, which is interested in legal education and lawyers, and I know the people of the Law and Society Review and the Journal of Law and Social Inquiry. So if you think about, and I could read your dissertation and tell you if there's an article in there that might be published in one of these journals, I can help you do that.
wow, that would be great.
Amazing.
And
I did that with a dissertation from Argentina, and it was very successful. So, so we can see. But I look forward to staying in contact with many of you, and thank you. It's
yeah, thank you, and congratulations for the book as well. I can't wait to read it. In September, you said it will come up?
Well, I think September 21st is when it becomes freely available online. It's University of California is the first to do this, and we don't have to contribute any money or anything. They will publish it simultaneously because I teach at the University of California. And I think, that's the way to go in the future. So it will be, PDF available at that point. So, yeah.
Sometimes people in Indonesia have a barrier of region accessibility. So maybe Awaludin needs to download it and spread it in Indonesia.
Yeah, it will be good if we can translate also in Indonesia.
Yes.
So maybe many people can read it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm open to that. Make sure you like it when you read it. Otherwise, don't translate it. But I think it's a pretty brave, more theoretical, first part than we've attempted in the past. So we'll see. We pushed the boundaries a little bit, and it was fun for us. So we'll see how you all react. But thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Stay healthy, Professor.
You too. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. Brian.